Okay, I think I'll start. Okay, um, great. So I'm going to start with R now. Um, just by way of I don't know, confession or explanation. I over time, what I teach in R has sort of kept creeping up, and our functions now do a lot more than they used to when we first started a couple of 2-3 years ago. And so there is a fair amount of material that I want to cover. I have some caveats. I'm just going to skip through those slides. Just that the goal here is not to teach you to program in R. The goal here is to get you to be able to use our functions, which use standard R functions, and facilitate your analysis. That's the goal. And okay, and but this is a more important caveat, and that I think I alluded to last week. It is not a helpful handholding program, unlike a lot of commercial packages. When you make a mistake, I think I showed you an example last time. It doesn't say much, or what it says is not helpful. So the first the rule that I follow is that I do almost no data management in R. Excel is far superior as far as data management goes. So I use Excel to manage all my data, get the data ready, and then just what I want to analyze, I copy to the clipboard, go into R. That's what we're going to do today. And just little things, when you make up names for variables, you can't have hyphens, which is silly. You can have underscores, but not hyphens. And you can't have spaces. So it gets confused. When you read your data into R, the first thing you should do, we're going to do that today, is make sure you have the right number of observations and variables, because you will tell R to do some analysis, it'll go away and come back with some results, and you want to be confident that what R analyzed is exactly the data set that you want it to analyze. So we will see when you read your data into R, it'll tell you how many observations, how many variables. Look at that first. And the other thing to know, in R, it goes back to certain programming conventions. The upper and lower case are all different. So we're going to have a data set called capital all caps NEJM. But if you spell it this way, that's something else. R won't think that these three are the same at all. And at any time you type a command into R and you get a plus sign, what that means is something went wrong, because R thinks you didn't finish typing and it's waiting for more. So you need to get out of whatever you are typing. And the way to do that is to hit the escape key. When you hit the escape key, at any point, R will go back to its prompt. The prompt is a greater than sign. And then this greater than sign is what you want when you type a command. And you type what you think is a full command, and it responds with a plus sign. That means you didn't finish in its view, maybe a missing parenthesis, whatever. So look at what you did, but hit the escape key to get out. I think that is pretty much caveat. I have some references to books, which I don't use at all. I just Google. I say, Google knows if I say R space something, that I'm talking about the R programming language. Okay, so a little bit about the interface. I trust you've all launched RStudio on your computer, and most of the time, if you're not into programming, you will see three windows in R. Okay, so there is a console where you will be typing your commands, and you will see the what R puts out in response. And the other major window is down here on the lower right. Plots, packages, and help. R will switch freely between plots and help depending on what you type. Like if you type a command that produces a graph, it'll show the plots window. If you type a help question, it'll show the help window. But in case you need to navigate there, those are the three tabs that you would be interested in. And this, not so important, and it just tells you the data you have there and variables you have and so on. Okay. And so what I have done is that over time, I have read multiple data sets and saved them. We're going to do that first thing today, and we'll skip that. 11 functions I'm going to be teaching you. And as I mentioned last week, if you type question mark, one of the functions, it'll give you help information in the help window. And the typical function has lots of possible arguments, but we won't be using most of them. All those arguments are for people if you want more flexibility and so on in what you get. And we'll address them at some point, some of them at some point. And CU-1-way, which will be one of the first things that we learn. The simplest way is just two arguments. You say what you want to analyze and what the group variable is. That's it. But it has a huge number of additional options to control non-parametric or parametric analysis, or the way you want the graphs to look and so on. I showed you this crib sheet last time, and I won't go into them now. And we have this web tool, and we'll get to that after we have learned our function. Sort of an overview page. CU-functions.html gives you an overview of the functions we have. As I mentioned, R is very, very terse and not at all friendly. So look at these to help on question mark CU table 1, and if you type it without the 1, R gets lost. Or if you type the question mark, it'll actually give you the complete source code. I think I mentioned it last time. It's an open source program. So when I write a function and my friend Steve writes a function and we make it available to you, you download it, you now have our source code. Your computers have the complete source code of whatever Steve and I did. So, and you can change that if you feel like. That's what broadly the analysis we're going to do. So I'm going to divide it between continuous variables and categorical variables. So with continuous outcomes, like where we did t-tests in Excel, we're going to learn to do one-way ANOVA, summary stats, learn to do non-parametric tests, two-way ANOVA, and a covariate, and I'll explain these terms as we get to them. Repeated measures analysis, where you do a crossover study, and you can have a second factor, and finally multiple regression. Okay, so let's start with that. So I would like you to, in the data file, go to the NEJM tab, which is where we did the t-tests a couple of weeks ago, and this is data. So the way you get data into R is you highlight the columns with the data. It's a good idea for the column not to have any data, some other stuff at the bottom. If you do, then you have to take the trouble to highlight just the part that you want. So if you don't have such stuff down below, just highlight the columns. So here in this case, highlight A through M, copy to clipboard. The general format when you make up your own, when you have your own data, is the variables. There's one variable in each column, and you have the variable name at the top. And note here, these are the variable names. And note that in this case, I have an extra row at the top that I want R to ignore. And I'll tell you how that is done as well. Because sometimes you may have multiple header rows. So the last header row should be the variable name. And above that, you may have other stuff. In RStudio, the first thing is to read the data. So I want you to type this in RStudio. NEJM equals CU read skip equals 1. I hope people can read the command off the screen. And CU read is a function that we have that will read the data into R. And it does some other things also. So we wrote a function. And skip equals 1, remember there was an extra line at the top of the data above the variable name. So skip equals 1 tells R, ignore the first line and start with the second line. What our function does is it reads the data from the clipboard, and it'll do it will look slightly different on a Mac because Mac syntax is different for reading from the clipboard. And then this is the useful part. It lists all the variables it read and how many it read. So you want to look at these things. I mean, you didn't copy to the clipboard properly, perhaps you didn't highlight all the columns, etc. So you need to get that resolved before you start doing anything at all. And then it tells you what the variables are and what the initial few subjects values are. And so, for instance, I'll return to this later. I have a typo in this variable. They're all cholesterol level values, but this value, instead of 208, I put it in as 20.8. So at least if you make some horrible typo in the beginning of the data file, you'll see it here. So it's useful to take a look. Okay. Now, we are not going to analyze this data right away because I want to show you how I like to do this. What I want to do is to read this data. Now I want to save it in R, and then so the next time, like we may come back to this next week, you don't have to reread the data into R. So I want to show that to you, show how to. But this is something that I hope you will find useful in your own data as well. So if you may need to analyze a data set in more than one sitting, it helps to see you read, then quit saving workspace, and then relaunch RStudio. That's the idea. So it seems strange, but the point is there's no need to read that data set again. It'll be there in RStudio anytime you want to analyze. We're going to analyze 3 data sets. I mean, we have actually going to analyze about 5 data sets, but 3 of them, it may span sessions. So I want you to read all 3 data sets now, save them all, quit RStudio, and then get back into it. So then you won't have to do it again. I could be having you reread the data each session, but I want you to learn how to do it for your own work. Okay, so I want you to go to the next tab. We did scatter plots on this tab a couple of weeks ago. And so go to MET, select the columns A through N, copy to clipboard, and do a CU read. And it tells you all the variables and how many observations, how many variables. Again, just check that things look okay. Specifically in this case, 85 observations, 14 variables. You don't need to proofread anything. Okay, and then now we want to bring a third data set into R to save. And so this is the Delta tab, which we haven't looked at before. So I would like you to go there, select A through N, copy, and do a CU read again. We have the three data sets now. So I'll just say in passing, each of these commands, NEJM equals CU read, skip one, and met equals CU read, and delta equals CU read. These are commands that you actually have to type yourself into RStudio. Later on, we will see, at least for my teaching sessions, you can copy paste from your PDF. Answer to very simple is that typically you have one clipboard in your computer. So you got your data in your clipboard. So when you're reading data into R, you cannot copy paste. And so you have to type the command yourself. Okay. So your console should look a little bit like this. I read NEJM and met, and then see delta equals CU read. And then you see up there, at least in my environment window, it says you've got these three data sets there. Okay, so Nidhi, see, this is a thing that about teaching. I'm learning something every time. So Nidhi says that in fact you can use the history, which I have never looked at, never all these years. She says that actually has all the commands you typed, and so you can get a command from there into your console. That's great, Nidhi. That's great. I will put that in into the next version of my slides. Thank you. Okay, so now we want to quit RStudio, saving these three data sets and then relaunching, so that after that we don't have to reread the things until this course is finished, and then of course you will free the space as Hanwei suggested may want to do. So you see here, if you type ls open close, it tells you that you have delta, met, and NEJM. These are some local variables that got defined. And so now what I want you to do is to say quit with yes inside. And what that says is quit RStudio, saving the workspace. I almost never need to save the workspace. So I always quit R and say no to save workspace. But in this case, I want you to say Q yes. And now I want you to relaunch RStudio, and you will see a message at the bottom. After Steve's name, you should see a message, workspace loaded from R data. So if you see that, that means the data sets that were read in last time, your previous session, are now there, and no need to copy from Excel, CU read, and so on. So as far as these three data sets are concerned, delta, met, and NEJM, whatever analysis we do in the next couple of weeks, you don't need to be getting the data from Excel. They are there in R. And if you want, you can confirm with ls open paren. This is a nice feature, but this caveat doesn't apply to my teaching part. It applies to your own data. It's very nice that you have the data in RStudio, so you don't have to bother getting it back from Excel every time. But what if you edit your data and the data change in Excel? So then when you go into RStudio, you need to reread that, okay? So you read that data set, and then you need to save it permanently in R by doing what we did just now. You need to Q yes, so that the stored workspace now has the updated data set. Because if you don't do this, you can see you read that data set, do the analysis that session, But if you quit and then go relaunch RStudio next week or something, you'll be back to the earlier version. Thank you, Karina. So, so remove is the thing, is the way you remove data sets from the workspace. And so, Sarah, you can save, but I don't see the point. If you want to speak up, I'm happy to answer. Because in my experience, this is all I'm interested in saving. Anything else, the console output, the graphs, and so on, I just copy in the session and get it into PowerPoint or Word or whatever, or Excel. So I haven't seen the need to save every time I quit.
Okay. But if you saved at the end and not right when you load it in, you'll still save it forever, right?
I'm sorry?
You don't have to save as soon as you load it. If you did forget and then saved it.
Oh, no, that's right. That is the whole point. Yeah, I'm sorry if I didn't make that clear. That is, from going forward, you will see in the next couple of weeks, you will be quitting RStudio multiple times. You will quit at the end of each day and so on. You're not going to be saving it. But when you come back next week and you launch RStudio, the datasets will be there. These 3 datasets will be there. So that's the point. So you don't need to resave every time. And that is also, Sarah, your question is important because that's also the reason for this caveat. Because if you edit your data and you reread the data into R, you must quit with yes, so that the R's copy is the permanent copy is correct. If you don't do that, it'll just go back to the previous copy, the previously saved copy. So what is saved once with a Q save is what is going to be there permanently until you do another Q save. This is a way to check for missing data. I'm not asking you to do this. Just take a look at the, what I did. I found it to be somewhat useful. See, this doesn't tell you if any subject has missing data or not. And suppose you have some question, you may have hundreds of data points and so on. So if you do, if you type this command, str, okay, so this is the first time I'm telling you, you can copy paste this, by the way, if you want to try the command. Only the CU reads you can't copy paste for the reason I gave. So if you do this command, what this says is, give me some information on any JM if I omit all subjects with any missing data. That is, any subject that has any variable missing will be dropped, and this will do the summary of that. You will see it has the same 36 observations of 13 variables. So of course, I know that my data don't have anything missing. But when you're working with your own data, this is something that you may want to do. Just to, if you think you have no missing data, then, it should be, it should be confirmed. Okay. Now, again, it's okay to have missing data, but be sure you are in agreement about how many observations you have anything missing. So if you know, all right, I have about 50 subjects with something or other missing, then that should be reflected in this. Okay, so this I'm definitely going to skip. You can look at these slides and ask me questions if you like. This is a way to redefine new variables and so on. So, like for instance, we did how to change cholesterol, total cholesterol to millimolar terms. You can do that in R if you feel like, or you can create categories of your variables. So we're coming to the next command of interest, which is attach. That's not one of our 11 functions. It's a standard R function that you do need to know. What attach does is tells R, going forward, not permanently, just for this session, whenever I type a variable name, assume that it is coming from any JM. That is, look in any JM for that variable and do the analysis. Otherwise, R doesn't know when you type a variable name which data set you want it to be looking into for that variable. Because you could have the same variable name in multiple data sets. So R needs to know where to look. But it also makes your syntax much more convenient. So I would say generally, for many of the functions I'll be teaching, it's helpful to attach before you do the analysis. So attach is a very useful command, and you do it just once in a session. R will look at that data set for all data variables. No need to specify it in any command. If you don't attach, so you can try that now if you feel like. So just type mean of TC pre. Okay. So that is a function that gives you the average of a variable. So if you type mean of TC pre, you will find it says TC pre not found. But now attach any JM. And then, by the way, after you attach it, you don't have to retype this. You can use the up arrow to go up a couple of commands, and then it will show you mean of TC pre, and you can hit enter. And now you will get the mean average of TC pre. That's the attach. And so what R will do is that it'll look in that data set for all the variables and points to remember about attach. Issue the attach command just once in a session. Don't do it more than once. If you find an error in your data, fix the errors in Excel, copy to clipboard, but do a detach before you do the CU read and attach again. Otherwise, R will get confused about what are you doing now, changing the data set and you already have something attached. If you're analyzing a second data set, it's fine to keep the first one still attached as long as you don't have any variable names overlapping. That's what we're going to do. At some point in my teaching, you may be attaching 2 or 3 data sets in one session, but that's fine because I don't have any repeated variable names. Okay, so let's start with some serious analysis. So again, you can copy paste this command. So this function is called table 1 because this is sort of typical reports that manuscripts you may be writing. There's a table 1 in which you list a lot of variables, mean, standard deviations, proportions. If you have some grouping, do all that. So CU table 1 does that. So this is a simple CU table 1. I have a variable TC change and a grouping variable diet. That CU table 1 TC change diet tells R, take TC change and give me summary data by the grouping variable diet. So we're going to look at these 2 parts separate. So this is what it should look like. So it's giving you summary stats on TC change by group, by diet. So a diet has 3 possible diets. We did this a couple of weeks ago. The AAD diet, the Bono diet, and the step 1 diet. And so this CU table 1 tells you how many are in each group, what the mean, standard deviation, coefficient of variation, the things that we did in Excel, but quite a bit more. It also does normality testing, and then it also gives you for the whole cohort. So just a very convenient way for you to see a summary of the data. It also gives you what is called a box plot. And it's called the box plot because it has box and whiskers. That's what they're called. So the box, I'll go through what the box plot shows in a couple of minutes. Now, this is a paper that I had to read recently, so you can see the sort of complicated box plots that people produce using R. It's not my work. I just taken from a from a journal article. Okay, so now there are more things you can do with CU Table 1. You could actually do CU Table 1 data set. So if you do CU Table 1 of any JM, now notice I don't have a grouping variable here, just in the entire cohort. So it will do for each variable, it will say what the mean, standard deviation, etc. are. And then for categorical variables, it'll say if there are any missing and what the proportions are in the different levels. So I have made up data here, half women, half men. The diets, there are 12 in each group and so on. So that's what, and then it will do a box plot for every variable. Okay. NA is something that you need to know what it means. NA in R means not available, and not applicable, but not available. And the data are missing. So again, I don't want you to do this, just you can see what's on the slide. So if you do CU Table 1 TC change diet, we saw that before. And I created a new variable now called TC miss. And I said TC miss of 5 is not available. That is, I deleted the 5th data point. Now, if I do CU Table 1 TC miss, I will get a line saying, here you see, not available, solve 0. That means there are no missing data. But here, the 5th subject who happens to be on AAD has missing data. So in the AAD group, there are 11 with data and 1 missing. So that's the idea. Okay, so now there is another option which I use a lot myself, which is give me a summary of the entire data set, but do it briefly. I don't want all the details. I just want some basic stats, one for each variable, all in one table. And that's what this does. So again, you may want to copy paste this. And so the additional argument here is brief equals T. Remember I mentioned a while ago that CU functions, you can run them with just 1 or 2 arguments, but you can also have a lot of options. And these options then give you control over what actually gets displayed. So here, brief equals T means you say just 1 line for each variable. And so you get TC pre, mean standard deviation. That's it. You're not getting all the detailed stats about TC pre. And likewise for all the variables. And so you have a single table, which you may want to put it into your report, for instance, your manuscript. It still gives you a box plot for every variable, but it does it across diet groups. And the 25th to 75th percentile range is called the IQR. I think we talked about it in Excel, interquartile range. Your plots window, when every time it puts out a new plot, it doesn't mean you've lost the old plot. You can scroll. So these arrows help you to scroll through your plots. And they will be, if you do 30 plots in one session or 50, they will all be there. And at least so far, I haven't lost plots. Whereas the console output, if it goes more than a few hundred lines, you will lose, you'll start losing. The console seems to be limited. Actually, here finally, an explanation of the box plot. So as I mentioned, it's called the box plot because it has a box and it has whiskers. So the solid line in the middle is the median, not the mean. It's the median. Okay. And then the upper end of the box is the 75th percentile. The lower end of the box is the 25th percentile. And then this is a little bit tricky. It goes 1.5 IQR. The thought is that even if the data are not normally distributed, if they're reasonably distributed, all the data should be within 1.5 IQR. This is the IQR, and it goes 1.5 IQR out away from the box. And that should really hold all the data. and so R gives you that whisker end. But it's not necessarily 1.5 IQR. This line means you actually have a data point there. What I call smallest within 1.5 IQR of the 25th percentile. There is you actually have a value there. And likewise, this is the largest value you have within 1.5 IQR of the 75th percentile. And finally, you have these little points outside of the box and whiskers, and those are your outliers. So this is an attempt to give you a summary of your data and say, hey, this is what your data look like. Median, interquartile range, the range within which you expect most of the points to fall into, and any points that don't fall into that range. Okay. So this is just a joke about box plots, again from Randall Munroe. And okay, I like it mainly because it helps me to remember it's called whiskers. Okay, additional functions that you may find useful. There's standard R functions you can Google, etc. I don't need to be teaching it, but it's just examples of how you can produce histograms and how you can do correlations. So you just do R-core and you give the variables you want to do correlations of with C-bind in front of it. If you feel like you can copy paste this now. And here you're getting a correlation among TC-free, TG-free, HC-free, all the correlations among the three variables, and then the p-values. And what is nice in R, unlike Excel, is you can do a whole bunch of variables in one R-car command. Plus, you can also do non-parametric correlations, which are called Spearman correlations. The standard correlation is called Pearson. It's called the Pearson correlation. And so the Spearman correlation is a non-parametric analog of it. And I'll talk about that more when we get to non-parametric analysis. Basically, Spearman correlations are correlations of the ranks. And I'll talk about ranks later. And so if you say type equals Spearman, you can copy paste this again if you like. You will see the Spearman correlation and the p-value. Okay. If you really want the entire data set, all the correlations among all the variables, and if you don't feel like typing them all, you can say NEJM as matrix NEJM. However, R-car doesn't like categorical variables, and you have to delete them. So this is just there for your information. No need to do it now. Okay. So back to the serious analysis now. We start now. And some of the slides here I have already talked about before a couple of weeks ago. So I'll be sort of going pretty fast through them. So this is the paper again, that the data we're going to be analyzing. And this was a study design. You'll recall everybody on a baseline diet and people randomized to be one of 3 diets afterwards. And this is the study period. And so this is the point I made a couple of weeks ago, and that is that when you do a t-test, you're looking at difference between 2 means. And the way the t-test works, it takes a standard error of each group and computes a consolidated standard error for the mean difference. It all comes from the standard deviations of the 2 groups. And so when you have more than 2 groups, it uses just the pair of groups. If you're comparing A and B, it uses those 2 standard deviations. And if you compare C and D, you'll do different standard deviations. And so that is not a very useful way to do it. because you generally assume the same standard deviation all the groups. And so I think I went through this example a couple of weeks ago, so I'm not going to go through it again now. Just to say that when you just do 2 at a time, you may end up with 3.92 or 3.52. But if you combine all three, you get the best standard deviation to use. Okay, and I think I showed this slide again last time, and just to be clear, ANOVA decreases the influence of the outlier, but more importantly, everyone, non-statisticians, statisticians, whoever, knows that if you have more than 2 groups, you can't be doing t-tests. So, okay, now, so these are the functions we're going to be using. I already showed you CU table 1, and then we're going to be looking at these functions. Let's start with the analysis, actual comparison. So one way. So the function is called CU, the digit 1 way, CU 1 way, and you say what we want to do. This is what we did by unpaired t-test in Excel. So you say CU 1 way, TC change diet. And again, you can copy paste this command if that's convenient for you. And so you will get a summary as in CU table 1, and then the comparisons and the p-values, and you will get a bar graph. So I'll go through these slowly. So this is what you would have gotten if you do CU table 1 of TC change. Goes on, does the ANOVA, which you can ignore. What is important are the comparisons among the diet. So it's giving you these comparisons. So you will see that these numbers, 17.9, 12.3, and so on, are what you got in Excel as well. Of course, it should be the same, but the p-values would be a little different because this is done in a post hoc manner. ANOVA post hoc test. And so, like, this is called using Fisher's least significant difference. And so the Fisher's LSD gives you p-values of the group comparisons using a pooled standard deviation, 12 point. But without getting into all those minutiae, the important thing is that you have the diet comparisons. What this is saying is this is the difference in the means. This is a standard error of that. This is the p-value, which is also repeated in a summary form. And then it also gives you confidence limits on the difference. And so CL and CI are used synonymously. Confidence limits or confidence interval. Okay. And so this is what one way does for you. And just a little digression, why do we say post hoc? We call them post hoc contrast because it literally means after the event. And the way I learned stats, we were taught to do the ANOVA, and then only if the ANOVA p-value is significant, you proceed to do pairs of groups or more complicated contrast. And frankly, this is not what people do these days. And when I work with a colleague, the colleague wants to know how 2 treatments compare. The colleague cares little whether my overall ANOVA is significant or not. And so they want the p-values for specific group comparisons. So we're going to do them anyway. And group comparisons get done regardless of the ANOVA p-value. So I would say ignore the ANOVA p-value generally. That's why post hoc sounds a little weird, because this is what people come to you for the analysis, or that's what you want to analyze. There are different points of view on multiple comparison adjustment, and there are different approaches available. There are multiple things. ANOVA is a well-worked field. So there is Bonferroni, Tukey, etc. And for post hoc tests, I prefer to report the Fisher's LSD p-values, which are nominal p-values with no adjustment for multiple comparisons. and I'll just give my rant here as to why I don't do that. My view is to let the reader decide. Somebody who reads your report can decide. And how many variables, how many comparisons are you making for each variable? And but more importantly, how many variables you're comparing. Because the problem with all these Bonferroni, Tukey, etc., is that after ANOVA, they only control for the comparisons you're making for that variable. But most published papers, reports that you make, and so on, don't look at just one variable and doing an ANOVA. They typically, person looks at multiple variables. And so there is no control at all for that in the usual Bonferroni Tukey. There's no way to tell it, do the multiple testing, penalties, and so on. But remember, this is not the only variable I'm doing. I'm actually doing 6 variables. There is no provision for that. So that is why I prefer to give just a nominal p-value. Let the reader decide. The person who reads your paper can say, okay, they're looking at 3 outcomes, so I'm okay with 0.05 or maybe 0.02. But on the other hand, the reader might say, look, this person is looking at 20 variables. I'm not going to take any p-value seriously unless it's less than something much smaller number. So as I said, I don't find Bonferroni, etc., useful for the simple reason they don't adjust for the many variables being looked at. So that's the end of my rant. And okay, now on to the graph. This is the graph, bar graph. And the default, it gives you mean and standard deviation. I'll show you presently how you can change that. You can have it show mean and standard error. You can have it show median and IQR and so on. But first, we're going to spend some time. I think Sarah was interested in it. How to export a graph so that you can use it in Excel or PowerPoint, etc. And so there is an export option there, and so you want to choose copy to clipboard. You copy to clipboard, and then you can paste elsewhere. Now, what will happen when you copy to clipboard is that it's very convenient. You can paste the graph into whatever you want. There is a significant drawback to just going to clipboard and pasting it into something. You can shrink or enlarge, but you can't edit the graph. You can't change a word from something to something. And you want to change a font or some text or some color. So we have some options in CU functions, but not a lot. You may want more control. So in Windows, it's pretty trivial to get an editable graph. But you need an extra step and also some installs on a Mac. So I'll first show you how to do it in Windows. Again, I'm not going to dwell on this. And if you have any questions, you can email me. In Windows, you would say copy to clipboard. A window will open up. You would click metafile. The default, I think, is bitmap. You would click metafile. If you click metafile and then do copy plot, and then you go into PowerPoint and you just paste it into a slide. And you need to get rid of some outside space. There'll be some black space outside. You do a right click and crop, and then you'll get something like this, and then you will do the cropping, and that's it. You can scale, but more importantly, you can edit. So you right click on the image and you do an ungroup. People may know this sort of thing. In PowerPoint, if you do an ungroup, it will basically, it will ask you a question, is it okay or not? And you say okay. But once you've done that, this is what your PowerPoint image will look like. Pretty much everything is a little unit that you can edit and do what you want with it. You can change the text anywhere on the axes and so on. Change the colors. Okay. So now the next 4 slides are about Macs. Mac at the moment, I don't know why not, doesn't support metafile option. The metafile option makes it easy in Windows. But apparently, I think the reason is competition. Metafile, I think, is a format developed by Microsoft, and maybe Apple doesn't want to support it. So we have to create a metafile. Further, if you're using Microsoft Office on a Mac, it's not able to edit something called an EMF image, enhanced metafile image. And so you have to go through an intermediary, an open source Office. So if you don't need editable graphs, you can ignore it. And if you want to get into things, you have to do some additional stuff. I think I talked about this already. You have to install OpenOffice and more things to do each time. So things to do each time are, you have to, when you run CU one way, you have to add this option, little EMF equal big T. So that says create enhanced metafile. And when you do that, it will create an EMF file in your folder. You can change it to anything. You can change the name to whatever name you want with another option. With instead of T, you should actually give a file name, and it'll use that. And then start OpenOffice, and then you would say insert from this file. And then you would do a right-click break that will ungroup this message. Then you will save it as a PowerPoint file, and then you can work in regular PowerPoint. I have screenshots in the next two slides. So this is an OpenOffice interface. So you would do insert picture from file, and then you locate the .emf file, and then you get that file, get that picture into your OpenOffice, do a right-click break, and then save and so on. So that's it. Just one more thing. If you want to save a graph for later use in PowerPoint, etc., you have to do that EMF in Windows as well. You know, if you say, I don't want to paste it in right now, I'll work on it later, then you have to do that EMF. Windows, the file will be in the Documents folder. On a Mac, you'll see it somewhere. I don't know anything about Macs. I have something in the previous slide. Okay, so folks, I'm done with exporting graphs. CU one way, TC change diet, I want you to add dots equal to 1. And what that does is it'll show all your data points on the bar graph. And I find it very useful in terms of looking for outliers. There are two reasons I think this is a very useful option, not all the time, but at least when you first analyze your data. One is it shows all your data. So you can say, oh, does this make sense? Should I really have some point down here? Or what is this cluster? Whatever, you know, you can look at your own data better. But more importantly, increasing number of journals want the primary data on the graphs. So they think that it increases credibility and so on. And so they ask for it anyway. So the next option I want, you don't have to settle for mean and standard deviation. We have an option called E-bars. So E-bars equal to 1 is the default. If you change it to 2, you'll get standard error of the mean. Change it to 3, you'll get confidence interval, and or you can get IQR. This is what the graph would look like. I do want to do this, which is not directly related to CU functions, because I didn't know this and I learned this from my son. And so one problem with taking your console output and pasting it into Word, say you want that table 1, you want that table 1 into a Word document. The problem is that Studio displays things in what is called the fixed font. And so when you copy and paste that into Word, it remains in fixed font. And so people generally don't find fixed fonts nice to read, nice to look at. So if you want to use a standard variable font like Times Roman or Calibri, etc., Arial, it won't look lined up. So this is just to show you how to line up properly. So you highlight the relevant portion of the console output, copy to clipboard like this. So I did a CU table 1. I copied this to the clipboard. And then what I used to do was to paste it into Word and change it to a fixed font. That's all I knew to do. So what my son says is much better way is you first, even if you want to end up in Word, first go to Excel and you do paste special text and you paste this in. But before you do anything else, you can select, go to data, and then say data text to columns. Maybe some of you know this option. I didn't know this. So you choose data and text to column. And when you do that, it takes what you pasted in, instead of treating each line as belonging in just one cell, it puts it into multiple columns. And then you just click through and you will end up with the data in tabular form in Excel. And now you can copy this and paste it into Word or PowerPoint or whatever, and things will be lined up properly. And so you can see the difference. So this is a fixed width font, which is all I can do in my simplistic copy paste. But if you go through Excel and do text to columns, it will. So you do want to do one table at a time. The text to columns option won't work so well if you have multiple tables. You should do each table separately. Just to go back to the question mark CU one way, that's the basic command is just 2 arguments. Variable being analyzed and grouping factor. Those are the 2 variables that you need to put in. You have all these other options. So E-bars we already talked about, dots we already talked about, and then there are these options, the other options applied to categorical outcomes. We'll talk about it later. So you can see there are many, many options, and you can learn them at your leisure or not at all. You'll be fine as long as you're okay with what it normally produces. One thing that I have is this web tool where all the options are displayed, and then you can check boxes and so on to choose the options you want. And then this tool will construct the R command that you can copy paste. Hope that makes it easier instead of you having to type the many options that you want to override. Now I want to talk about nonparametric testing. And that nonparametric analysis is a big reason why people would need to use a statistical package rather than Excel. Now, data are assumed to be normally distributed when we do t-tests, ANOVA, and so on. We then need, so if the data are not normal, these are not appropriate and they are not valid. And so we need a non-parametric approach where no assumptions are made about how the data are distributed. So I think I showed you the slide before, these slides before, and asymmetry is the main reason for non-normality, and you can consider transformation. And I went through these slides, I believe, a couple of weeks ago. So I'm going to talk about Wilcoxon. So Wilcoxon was a statistician who worked out how to do the proper paired analysis and unpaired analysis, like the paired T and the unpaired T, when you don't have a normal distribution. There are 2 Wilcoxon tests, but the basic thing is that there are no assumptions made about the distribution. So what that means, this is maybe just focus on this for a moment, because it's non-intuitive, I find. So the only assumption in non-parametric analysis is if you're given 2 values, you can say A is less than B, A equals B, or A is greater than B. You can't say anything more than that. Specifically, you can't say anything about A minus B. So the best example, which I think I don't have on the slide, is that say you have some Likert scale and you have some 0 through 9 possibilities that people can enter. Now, you know that 0 in some sense is less than 1, 7 is less than 8. But the difference between 0 and 1 and the difference between 7 and 8 don't have to be the same. You can't say anything in a non-parametric analysis. 0 to 1 may be a much bigger change than 7 to 8, or the other way. So Wilcoxon makes no assumption about that. So that's the key point. So we can say nothing about A minus B versus C minus D. Is it less than or equal or greater? We cannot say. So no distribution is assumed. So how does Wilcoxon work? What it does is it first replaces the data with the ranks and then analyzes the ranks. Whether you do correlations or paired comparisons, unpaired comparisons, they're all done using the ranks without assuming a distribution. So there are two major Wilcoxon tests. One is this corresponds to the unpaired T, called the Wilcoxon rank sum. It's often also called Mann-Whitney, but it's the same. The other is a paired T analog, which is called the signed rank. And I'll show you in a few minutes why one is called rank sum and one is called signed rank. I mean, to me, they sounded the same. The done test, which is what we will be doing in R, it generalizes the rank sum to more than two groups. So you can do it with two groups as well, but it can handle any number of groups, just like what we did with the one way. So we'll still use one way, but we will say do a done test instead of the usual ANOVA post hoc. So you cannot do this in Excel. That should be obvious. First, want to show you with some small amount of data how Wilcoxon works. So you're not going to do any of this on your computer. Just follow along. So these are data that I took, maybe TC-Pre or something like that, from two of the groups. You have 5 numbers in this group, 5 numbers in this group. So what you do first is you look at all 10 numbers and say, where is the smallest value? And the smallest value is 183. So you put a 1 there. Then you say, what's the second smallest value? That's 187. You put a 2 there. Then you say, what's the third smallest value? And that turns out to be 200. And then 4 is 230, and so on. So you do this for the 10. So these 10 values, actual values, have been replaced by the ranks. Now you add the ranks. You get 36 and 19. Now, if the groups did not differ, right? If there is no difference between the two groups, then you would expect the ranks to be distributed at random between the two groups, so that the sums should be approximately the same. There's no reason for the sums to be different if the groups are not different. So you can now say, is 36 and 19, could that have happened by chance? So that's what the Wilcoxon rank sum does. It calculates a p-value for the sums of the ranks, which should be equal for equal size groups under null hypothesis. So that's what the rank sum test does. Now the signed rank is a little bit more convoluted, but I'll just go through. Again, you're not going to be doing any of this yourself, but I do want you to have, feel comfortable with what the Wilcoxon tests do, and so that you can also understand why some people prefer the Wilcoxon test so much. And so this is a paired thing. I took some of the data from our NEJM data. So these are 6 subjects, and this is the TC-Pre values, these are the TC study values, these are the change values. I think I already told you when we did t-tests in Excel that the paired T actually looks at the differences and compares them to 0. So what you do here with a signed rank is you first take the absolute values of all the changes. So -4 becomes 4, plus 19 stays 19, and so on. And now you do the ranks of these 6 values. So you say, what's the smallest value? But in this case, there are 2 smallest values. They're both 4. So you make them 1.5 each, right? And so one is 1, one is 2. So you have 2 that have the same rank, so you make them 1.5. And the others, so this is the 3rd position, so it gives a 3rd rank, and so on. And now this is the reason for the signed rank thing. So you add a sign to all the ranks based on whether the change was negative or positive. So this 1.5 becomes -1.5. This 4 remains 4. This 1.5 stays as plus 1.5, and so on. Now you add the signed ranks. So the signed rank test calculates the p-value for the sum of the ranks, which should be 0 under the null hypothesis. This is for the complete. So you have all these signed ranks and you add them up and you compare to 0. Okay. So the strength of Wilcoxon is that if some value, say here, the -42.7, that's the smallest value. Now, of all of these, if that were instead of -43, if it were -100, and if the biggest value 19 instead were 80, you would get identical p-values, whether you analyze these data or these data by Wilcoxon. And it's not just for the 2 extreme values. Other values also, if they move a lot, whatever, it has much less of an influence in Wilcoxon than in a t-test. Easy to see why, because the Wilcoxon is working with ranks. It's not working with the actual value. So that's the strength of Wilcoxon. Okay, so to get back to the data, I would like you to do this. CU one-way TC change diet, and the same option for getting standard error, etc. You use, if you say E bar is equal to 4, you're telling our CU function that you want to do a non-parametric analysis. You can see here, it does the Kruskal-Wallace rank sum test. That's the generalization of the Wilcoxon. And this is the analog of the ANOVA. And then, more importantly, you have pairwise comparisons using the unsolved pair. And that is, it generalizes the Wilcoxon rank sum. And you get these p-values. So the p-values are very similar by parametric or non-parametric analysis. So that's another reason to not shy away from Wilcoxon, because the Wilcoxon doesn't make assumptions about normality, but when the data are actually normal, you can see you lose a little bit. 0012 became 0019, 021 became 029. Not a big loss. And not that it always happens that way, but generally that's what happens. So you don't lose much. However, the parametric analysis gives you these numerical values for the differences and confidence interval. The non-parametric analysis cannot do that. As I mentioned before, it has no way to interpret differences or construct confidence intervals on the differences. It doesn't have the ability to do that. So if all you want to do is to compare groups, then the Wilcoxon may be fine. But if you want confidence intervals on the differences, or more seriously, if you want to do regression, which we will get to, you need to use parametric analysis. So you can't do non-parametric then. When you say E bar is equal to 4, it's going to display median and IQR. So these are not the mean, this is the medians, and you have the interquartile range. Now for some nuances when you run CU one way. As I mentioned, it tests for normality. If you do the one way with HC study, normality test fails in one of the groups. So it says data fail normality test, look for data errors, and maybe you should be doing the non-parametric done test. Now, in this case, I'm willing to ignore it because two of the groups look okay, and the p-value here is 0.27. All right, with 12 subjects, maybe it just happened, and so I'm willing to ignore it. Or you can take this message seriously and say, okay, I need to analyze with non-parametrically. And so that is, it's up to you. So CU one way won't force you to do a non-parametric analysis. It just warns you that perhaps you should be doing non-parametric analysis. Again, these are ways in which we hope our functions are useful in practice. So you don't, even if you don't think about it, it reminds you. It compares standard deviations across the groups and complains if the standard deviations are too different. So I have this variable called diff_var. It's a made-up variable. And so you can see that the standard deviations are very different in the three groups. It's 20, 31, and 7.5. So it does a statistical test called the Bartlett test for homogeneity of variances, and that is highly significant. And so our program says, this is no good. You cannot do the usual ANOVA. You have to do unpaired T with just unequal variances. That's what you have to do. But it does, here it goes ahead and does what it thinks is best. It doesn't ignore this problem. However, if you don't like it doing the unequal variance test, you can override it by having an option p_bart equal to something. If you say p_bart equal to 0, for instance, it will never do this. It will always do your one way. But of course, it may be the wrong thing to do. Also, this sort of thing may well happen because you have outliers, in one group or another that has increased the standard deviation a lot in that group. So that is something to look at closely. And so it says in the warning, look for data errors, focusing on groups with large standard deviation or unexpected min-max. So then it does what is called a t-test with non-pooled standard deviation by Welch's team. This may happen because of a typo or something in your data. So for instance, I made a typo here in this bad TCP where 208 was entered as 20.8. But what the result of that is that of course, you could have spotted this in the box plot as well. But even if you didn't look at your box plot, when you get to this, it will say, so it failed the normality test. And so you say, look at the min and max value. So you can see here, this minimum value is 20.8, whereas in the other groups is 160 and 141. So that's the thing to look at. I have one more option now in CU table 1, which is effectively do a one-way analysis of all the variables. So this is a way to get a very compact thing that you often need in table 1. In table 1, you list, say, your background demographic factors and so on, and you need to indicate if there is any difference there among the groups. So that is done as here, for instance, NEJM diet compare equals T. You may want to do this, and if you have any question, post it in chat. This is a new option that I put in last week, and so it gives you the CU table 1, the usual summary, but to the right of it, or depending on the width of your console window, down below maybe, you will get the comparisons. 1 versus 2, 1 versus 3, or 2 versus 3, and it tells you what the comparisons are. They're largely non-significant, but a couple of them are different and so on. So in your own data, you may have expected or unexpected differences that you may want to deal with. Done with one-way analysis, I'm now going to two-way. Two-way means you have two factors that whatever you're analyzing may depend on. So that is the TC change. Perhaps it doesn't just depend on the diet. Maybe the response is different in the two genders. So, how do you analyze that? And that's what this part is about. So the syntax again is pretty simple. You say CU2-way, TC change, sex, diet. You can give it in any order you want. You can say diet, sex, or sex, diet. It will affect mainly the way the bar graph looks. So depending on how you like the bar graph to be organized, you can choose the order. It first gives you summary stats for all the 6 groups. You have 2 sexes, 3 diet, so you have 6 sex-diet combinations. It gives you summary stats for all of them. And then it compares every group with every other group and gives you the p-value and the bar graph. So the bar graph here is organized because I said sex diet, it has female, male separated, and then within female, it has the 3 diets, and within male, it has the 3 diets. I want to go over the many comparisons that are done. You can see on the screen. You first have male-female comparisons. Within AAD, is there a difference between men and women? Just not diet effect, just on the diet, is there a difference? So, and on the mono, is there a difference? In the step 1, is there a difference? By the way, as I mentioned before, I made up the female-male data. This is not at all representative of any population. Importantly, it gives you diet comparisons within each sex group and between the sex groups. So it may be a little convoluted, and if you can think of a better way for me to phrase this, I'm happy to. This is how to read the output. So it says diet comparisons within and between. So you have mono minus AAD. You have within women, this is the diet effect. Diet effect is minus 38 in women and plus 2 in men. And it gives you the p-values for each. And then it compares these 2 numbers. It asks, is the diet effect going from AAD to mono, is that diet effect different between men and women? As you can imagine, this is highly significant because women went down a lot and men actually went up. So it's highly significant. So that's what it does. So the mono minus AAD in F, then in men, between M and F, and then the same thing is done for step 1 minus AAD and step 1 minus mono. So basically, every possible diet comparison, you do it within each gender and between, and also compare genders. Whatever factors you have, this is what the program will do. This is one of the features I really like a lot about what we did, because these are the questions. Some packages, including SAS, don't come out very easily. You have to learn some additional commands. The final thing that is done is that I decided it would be good to have these functions compare the results with simpler models. So I'll get back to this later under model selection, but you will notice that at the bottom of your CU2-way output, there are partial F tests. And after the comparison, it says a partial F test, the simpler model. So one model, which we'll talk about in a minute, is a model with no interaction. That is, you have a second factor, sex, but you're not expecting the diet effect to be different between the sexes. So that's what that model is. We'll get to that. It means that's called interaction. That is, if the diet effect is different between men and women, there is interaction. Or you could have a model with just sex or with diet. And what you see here is that this model is highly significant compared to all 3 simpler models. So it should give you more confidence in the model. That's the story there. Each partial F test is highly significant. This means that the two-factor with interaction model explains the data much better than two-factor without interaction, or one factor just sex, or one factor just diet. So this, I think it's important to look at that, because it may be that some analysis you try to do is unnecessarily complex. And so this will tell you if in fact it's too complex. This is something that is becoming increasingly popular when people present their results in bar graphs. You have lots of bars in the graph, and so the way a lot of people still indicate differences is they draw lines or they put asterisks and they say this asterisk means that this bar is different from this other bar, and so on, or this line and double dagger starts to get very complicated, very messy looking as the number of bars increases and the number of significances that you want to show increases. So an alternative has come into popular use. It's called compact letter display, or what I call CLD. This is for a non-parametric test. It's not exactly what you have on your thing, because you didn't do E bar is equal to 4. There are non-parametric analysis of this sex diet two-way. This is what the bars have. These are the letters that the bars have. What happens in CLD is that if two bars have different letters, here this one has an A, this one has a B, that means that these two bars are significantly different at the chosen critical value. Could be 0.05, could be 0.01, whatever. But if two bars share a letter, they don't have to all be the same. If they share a letter, they are not different from each other. So B and BC, these two bars are not different. And these two bars have the same letter, CD, CD, they are not different from each other. But neither of them is different from BC because they share C with that. And at the same time, neither of them is different from this because they share a D with that. The reason for this somewhat messy symbology is that you're now able to see cases where, for instance, these two bars, they're not different from this or from this, but these two bars are different from each other. This green bar and this green bar are different from each other because they don't share a letter. So this is something that happens a lot when you compare groups. Two groups are very different, but then there is some other group in between that is not different from either one. So this green and this green are different from each other, but these two groups, they're not different from this and they're not different from this. So the compact letter display conveys that information. Once people get used to that, it's a lot easier to read a graph and see what is going on than to be looking at all the asterisks and daggers and reading the footnotes. So Remy Crusoe, took my mini course last year, and he sent me data with a two-way where there were 5 roots and 6 tissues. So there were 30 subgroups possible. He also had missing data, so I found I had to actually improve my functions, and especially for the algorithm for CLD. And this is a footnote for anyone interested in mathematics. There is some thing in graph theory, thing to do with making graphs. And now, what I mentioned before, it is possible for you to do a two-way analysis without interaction. You could say, there are 2 factors I'm interested in, but I don't expect any interaction. That is, I don't expect the diet effect to be different between the sexes, or the sex difference to be different from one diet to another. So I would like you to do this. So you say TC change sex diet interact equals F. So note the spelling, not interaction, interact, and then capital F, meaning false. There's no interaction. So the initial output would look the same, but the comparisons are a lot different. They are a lot fewer comparisons being made because we don't have interaction. So there is just one sex comparison, M minus F. You don't have M minus F in the different diets. And then only 3 diet comparisons. There is just one mono minus AAD. You don't have mono minus AAD in F and M and then comparing the two and so on. All that is gone. And so sex comparison without regard to diet and diet comparisons without regard to sex. So that's what you have. And then it gives you the partial F test. So in this case, what you find is that adding sex didn't actually help anything. So it was not particularly improved. So that's something to keep in mind. So just to summarize, with interaction, you get the sex difference in the 3 diets separately. Without interaction, you get 1 sex difference. And then without interaction, you have just 3 diet comparisons. Mono minus AAD, step 1 minus AAD, and so on. But with interaction, the mono minus AAD, there is 1 in F and 1 in M. Step 1 minus AAD, there is 1 in F and 1 in M, and so on. And finally, because there is interaction, you also get to see the comparison of F to M within each diet comparison. So this is asking, as I said before, and I can't repeat it enough time because it's a little bit tricky to understand, is the diet effect different between men and women? That's what this is asking. And so you ask that question for each diet effect. The mono effect compared to AAD, that's the difference, and so on. Maybe interested in seeing, what is the difference between 1-way and 2-way? What do I gain by doing sex and diet as 2 factors if I'm not expecting any difference? There is a slight difference because the standard deviations are slightly different in the groups, and that goes into the p-values. So you will see here that when you just do 1-way, you're going to get the same differences as in the 2-way without interaction, but the standard errors are slightly different, and so the p-values are slightly different. That's all. So, to look at interaction 2-way, you can look at 1-way in subsets. You may want to do subgroup analysis in R and not have to read your data, just with that subgroup or something like that. So this is how you do it. So I would like you to type these commands. You detach NEJM, and then you define a new data set. It says NEJFEM, and that's a subset of NEJM sex equal to F. That's what this does. And it is a useful function for you to know, because sometimes you may want to analyze just a subgroup, and you don't want to go to the trouble of sorting your data in Excel and then coming back to R. So this is how you can do it. You can say, do a subset sex equal to F. And now you attach that, and you can do CU table, etc. You can do what you want. And so if you do that, you can copy paste these commands. You can copy paste them one at a time, and you notice when you define a subset in R, you can't just use one equal sign. You have to use a double equal sign, and the reason is too complicated to explain. It has to do with programming rules, and so if you do that, if you do that NEJ FEM and do the 1-way in that group, mono minus AAD minus 38, and you'll see the exact same number here. with interaction, because with interaction, you're going to get the diet effect separately in the two sexes. So you get the same value here in the complete data set allowing interaction as you do when you take a subset and analyze just that subset. So you get minus 38, minus 31.2, and 6.78. And that's what you have here, minus 38, minus 31.2, 6.78. You get the same values. But the SEs are a little different because here, this is using a pooled standard deviation from all 6 groups, and here it's using a pooled standard deviation from just the subset. So the standard errors are a little bit different, 4.0 and 4.4, and so the p-values are also a little bit different. I personally prefer to do two-way. I think that is a better, more solid, robust estimate of the standard error, and it also explores sex differences. Okay, so I have a cartoon which I'm not going to leave even with enough time for you to read. We are going to return to one-way, two-way for categorical outcomes a little bit later, sometime next week. But for now, Hanwei asks a good question. I think, Hanwei, it's a matter of judgment. And it is quite subjective. Because if 1 out of 3 groups or 1 out of 6 groups, if you had done a two-way, and each group has only 6 people, and if one of them violates the normality, you're going to say, oh, I think it's okay. I can live with that. I introduce regression in a way that comes up a lot. That is, you're doing an analysis, one-way analysis or two-way analysis, but you want to control for like one variable, which is continuous. Not categorical, but continuous. So the question is how to do that. If you're just comparing groups, unpaired T, Wilcoxon, Dunn, etc., you may want to control for another factor, usually continuous factor called the covariate. A covariate is a factor that may affect the outcome of interest. We're going to see covariates more when we get to logistic regression and so on, but that's what a covariate is. It's not something that you are focused on. That's not your main interest, but you want to control for it. So if you want to, for instance, compare salaries of men and women, you need to take into account years of education, or income as an indicator of social class, and so on. And then see, controlling for those things, do you still see a difference in salaries of men and women? So in this example that we're going to be doing, it's a starting value. Though, as you recall, our study design, everybody was on the same diet for 12 weeks. So I say, well, maybe whatever value they had then can be used as a covariate. So it's, I have these 3 reports, but examples of where people have used covariates. And so this is a problem that I'll come back to. So maybe I'll spend a minute on it because this is people may want to look this up because I find that this particular study I can use to illustrate many of my functions. Apparently, for people who don't know, newborns, if they do a heel stick, my residents would know a lot better than I. So Victoria et al. Just correct me if I'm screwing something up here. I understand they do a heel lance to get a drop of blood from a newborn infant for analysis, and they do feel pain, and they scream like hell, and apparently they feel more pain the more premature they are. That's one thing. Also, apparently the pain is somewhat alleviated if they just tasted something sweet. Why that is, I don't know. So apparently they give some oral sucrose to reduce pain intensity during what they say tissue damaging. They mean just a lance, a heel lance. So they did 245 neonates from 4 Canadian NICUs, and they were born over a fairly wide range. This is relevant for what I want to say. Gestational age, and they were randomized to receive one of 3 doses of sucrose. They were trying to figure out what's the good dose of sucrose to give before a heel lance. And so the primary outcome was pain intensity, measured 30 and 60 seconds following the heel lance, and they had some scoring scheme for that. So if you just, you say, well, why can't I just do post hoc teas of 30-second or 60-second pain score? That's the outcome, and I have 3 doses, I do it one way. But it turns out the gestational age may influence the pain score. As I mentioned, apparently the more premature babies experience more pain. And so they did an analysis of covariance adjusting for gestational age. So this is what we're going to do. But the reason for me to go through this, I'm going to come back to this example and show how some of the other things, functions as well, can be used here. Okay, so this I'm going to skip another example where they a couple of more examples where they did these took into account a covariate. I mean, you can read the article, etc. It's just a little promotion so that you feel a little more interest in what I'm about to tell you. And final digression, which is more to the point. There was an article a few years ago about sales tax and health, and it turns out that if you look at state and local taxation, a state that claims to have no income tax, in fact, ends up having a lot of tax on poor people through sales tax, whereas a state like Vermont has much less. So they looked at the effect of a total tax burden on a single mother of 2 at the poverty level, and what the consequences were. So they did a fairly complicated analysis. So I'm not going to go through all the details. I'm just going to get to the summary and ask questions. And I've thrown in the scatter plot here, which we looked at a long time ago, and just to refresh your memory about slopes. So when we did the scatter plot, the equation was y equals 1.55x minus something. What does that 1.55 mean? That means that if x goes up by 1 milligram per deciliter, Tg goes up by 1.55. Or if Tc goes up by 10, Tg goes up by 15.5. So that's what that slope means. So having refreshed your memory on that, I now have questions. I would love it if people would answer me. So this is what they found. For every $100 increase on taxes at the poverty line, that is, they had 50 states or whatever, and they had the total tax burden in each state and various outcomes. So there was a mortality outcome, deaths per 100,000 people, or property crimes per 100,000 people, or high school completion. So what they found was that for every $100 increase, they had 7 additional deaths per 100,000, 78 additional property crimes per 100,000, and 1/4 percentage point decrease in completion, high school completion. So now the questions that I would appreciate people trying to answer. So if you say deaths per 100,000 equals D, that's the slope, like that 1.55 in the TC scatter plot, times the tax at poverty line, plus some other confounder. So what is the value of D based on their summary of results? Thank you, Anastasia. So it is 0.07, as Anastasia says, because this is 7 deaths increase per $100 increase in taxes. So if you just say tax at poverty line, then D is 0.07. And they're reporting it as per $100 increase because it's easier to understand 7 than 0.07. So then if you do property crimes per 100,000. So that has a slope of p times the tax. So that should be easy. Same idea as in that 7 becoming 0.07. And so here the 78 will become 0.78. So, and so finally, the percent completing high school. So you have 0.25 here. So you might say it's 0.25 divided by 100, but it's a little more complicated. It's 0.25 divided by 100 with a change of sign, because it'll be minus 0.0025. So that's what H is. And so that's the basic idea in reading regression equations. So we're going to be looking at some regression equations in the next few minutes, and that's the idea. So you don't have to do this. You can if you feel like, but I'm just going to show you how regression compares with the ANOVA that we did, the one way that we did. We did a one way of TC change and diet. So you can also do it as a regression. So if you say fit change equals LM, that's an R function that does linear modeling. TC change tilde diet. Tilde means TC change depends on diet. And when you look at it, you may recognize these values, 17.9 and 12.3. They appear in your diet effects compared to AAD. This is the equation that the linear model produces. Minus 1.9 minus 17.9 times diet mono minus 12.3 times diet step 1. So, so you do need to sort of know what these things mean. The reason for these new variables is that diet is a categorical factor. It's not a continuous variable like TC pre or something else. It's a categorical factor. And so when R does the regression, it can't just say some slope for diet. There has to be an effect for the mono diet compared to AAD and for step 1 diet compared to AAD. And so what it does is it makes up these dummy variables, as they're called. Diet mono is a 0-1 variable. It's a 1 for a mono subject and 0 for other subjects. And diet step 1 is also a 0-1 variable. It's 1 for a step 1 subject and 0 for other subjects. So the idea is that if you know that somebody's diet, you can easily see what the values are. So for instance, if for an AAD subject, what is diet mono and diet step 1? It'll just be 0 and 0, because the person is not on mono, not on step 1, so both are 0. Now, for a step 1 subject, diet mono will be 0, diet step 1 will be 1, and so on. So you can follow what is going on. Read the slide now or later, and the other way, if you know diet mono in step 1, you can figure out what the diet is for that person. So if mono is 1 and step 1 is 0, it has to be mono. If mono is 0 and step 1 is 0, it has to be AAD, because they're both 0. And if it is 0 and 1, it has to be step 1. And finally, of course, you can't have both 1. So when you have these dummy variables constructed from a categorical variable, you can only have one of them non-zero for any subject. So the way to understand this equation is to say, for an AAD subject, these are both 0. So the model says TC change is minus 1.9. And for a mono subject, it's 1 and 0. So the equation becomes minus 1.9 minus 17.9 or minus 19.8. And finally, for a step 1 subject, it's 0 and 1. So you plug in 0 and 1 in this equation, 0 here, 1 here, and you end up with minus 14.2. So what this regression result summary says is just this. It's just saying this more convoluted way. But there is a reason for this convolution, because as the model gets more and more complicated, Chan is here as a TA, and she knows I'm working on a project with her where we have multiple variables, categorical variables, and then you have to add different coefficients to come up with what it is actually saying about any one type of subject. So it is important to know how to read these summary tables. So the minus 17.9 is just the mono effect compared to AAD, and minus 12.3 is a step one effect compared to AAD. So now I also want to show you how the regression LM, how its output is the same or differs from the one-way output. So this was the regression output. You can see here that the p-values for mono versus AAD are the same. 0, 0, 1, 2, 0, 2, 1 here, 0, 0, 1, 2, 0, 2, 1 here. And the regression coefficients, we have already talked about how they compare. So the TC change AAD minus 1.9 appears as the intercept here. And the mono effect minus 19.8 is just the sum of these two. And the minus 14.2 here is the sum of 1.9 and 12.3. That's it. And so this is this one p-value the simple regression thing doesn't do, and you have to do some additional stuff to do it. But anyway, I'm not trying to promote this, but I just want you to feel comfortable that using regression and doing a one-way, it's the same thing. In fact, you will see in our one-way, two-way output, the regression actually gets done along the way. You see the regression table there if you look at the output. The way I want to motivate regression here is that until now, we were looking at TC change. The change on AAD versus the change on mono versus the change on step one. But suppose we say, instead of that, we say, we'll just look at the final value and control for the starting value. It's slightly different from looking at the changes. This is similar to what that pain study from Canada did. They were looking at the pain score, controlling for gestational age. So here, we're going to be studying the final TC study, controlling for the starting value. So this I would like you to copy paste because it's important. Oh, by the way, you should attach NEJM, because in case you are fooling with NEJ-FEM, you need to detach that and then attach NEJM. I would like you to copy paste this. So this is our fourth or so function that I'm talking to you about that we have written. This is called CU-COV one-way. So basically, it's a covariate controlled one-way. So the difference here is that between TC study and diet, you stick in TC pre. Before we did CU two-way with sex there, but here the factor instead of sex, it's starting cholesterol level. So you do TC study, TC pre diet. And if you do that, you should get these outputs. So it just gives you first how it compares across diets. Notice that the reason I'm showing this is that if you compare TC study across the diets, they are not statistically significantly different. And the reason is that they all started with very different values of cholesterol. And so the standard deviation here is enormous. And so these differences are not significant. So now, next, the function controls for TC pre. And you will see this is the regression model but you don't have to be reading and understanding it. But using the regression results, it does all the comparisons. This is what you should have in your console. Have 12 point is the intercept, and 0.9197, that's the slope of TC study with TC pre, and it's assumed to be the same in all three groups. And then, and it's highly significant. And so that's the p-value. So that also means it's a good thing TC pre is in the model. Okay, so then let's look at the diet effects. So 16.7 and minus 12.3, what are they? And not so different from what we saw in that simplistic analysis with linear modeling. 16.7 is the effect of mono compared to AAD. And step one, the 12.3 is the effect. And they're both significant. And then finally, CU-COV one way does the diet comparisons. It tells you mono minus AAD is minus 16.7. This is the p-value and the confidence limit. And the p-values get summarized at the end. And of course, it does the partial F-test as usual. And it's a great improvement over any simpler model. Not taking the covariate into account, you don't do as well. And or just using the covariate, not using the diet, you don't do so well. So this model is good. You basically have 3 lines, and you have 1 line for each group. And you're able to do this because there's only one continuous variable. So you should see this in your graphics window, and you have all the 36 subjects. You have TC pre on the x-axis, TC study on the y-axis, and different colors, and the lines. So the lines are from the model, and you have the points. So the green mono line, that's this one, is 16.7 below the red AAD line. That's what that minus 16.7 is. And likewise, the minus 12.3 is going to be the difference, the gap between the blue line and the red line. So the 3 lines are parallel in this case. The diet effects are the same at any TC pre. That is, whether the person started at 160 or 220, the model says the diet effects are the same. But next, we will allow the slopes to be different. The lines won't be parallel. There's another cartoon that I'm going to skip. This is how you specify interaction. We already talked about interaction for a categorical factor between sex and diet. Here you have a continuous factor, TC pre, and with interaction. So you don't say interact here. You instead say which TC pre levels you want to make comparisons. As I mentioned before, when the lines are not parallel, you have to make a separate comparison at different TC pre's because the effect is not the same at all levels. So you give that, and when you give that, CU-COV one way realizes that you're trying to have interaction in the model, and so it fits the corresponding model. I see that the slopes are not the same. It's 1.01 in AAD, and it's 1.01 minus 0.08 in mono, 1.01 minus 0.23 in step 1. So those are the slopes, and this is what you get here. You notice these 2 lines look somewhat parallel, but they're not actually parallel. And this blue line clearly is not parallel to the other. So the previous model, there was the same slope in all the groups. So here it's more complicated. And so when you go through and get all the equations, you get this. So it's minus 3.2 and 1.01 for the AAD subject. It's just straight from the table. But when you come to the mono subject, you take the minus 3.2 and minus 3.4, you get 6.6. And the slope also 1.01 minus 0.08, it becomes 0.93. And similarly for the step 1 subject. So this becomes harder to interpret because you don't know you can't just say these are the diet effects or something like that. So because the lines are not parallel. So the diet effects depend on the starting value. So you call one way makes the comparison and you get lots of output in your console. Sarah, I'm sorry, very smart, good question. And in this case, our data range from like 140 to 230. So I'm interested in comparing the diets at some values over the range. So the values you would put in for your data set would be the values of the covariate where you want the group comparisons to be made. So in this case, I think it's reasonable to make comparisons at 160, 180, and 200. So I gave those values. So you can have even just one value. I could have said C of 175. Or yeah, so and so what the again it should be clearer here. It does the diet comparison at 160 and then at 180 and then at 200. It does the mono minus AAD at each of those levels, step 1 minus AAD at each of those levels, and so on. And then it gives a summary of p-values taken from here. At 160, these are the p-values comparing the diets. At 180, these are the p-values, and so on. So it just gives it to you in a convenient fashion. And at least in SAS, I know this used to be a nuisance for us to do, and so it was important for me that CU-COB one way does it automatically, provided you say that you have a interaction. And again, it does partial F-test with simpler models. But in this case, even though the lines look different, it turns out it doesn't actually improve the fit compared to that simpler model we did. So the model is not better than with the same slope. You can see in this slide a complicated model with a lot of non-significant coefficients and a standard error of 12.76. And the simpler model, the standard error was 12.48. There was no improvement. In fact, it declined a little bit because you have more parameters in the model. So in this case, you're better off with the simpler model. And of course, the partial F-test also shows that, says that it's not an improvement. You don't have to run the simpler model to see this. Our COB one way provides the information for you. So I'm going to skip this thing about the p-values not getting better. I could have mentioned it even in one way. Or SAS, all packages, they generally order your categorical variable alphabetically. That's what they do. So here, of course, in our study, AAD was the reference diet, but we also chose the names that way. So AAD comes before mono and step 1 in the alphabet. And so AAD is made the reference group by the package, by R, by CU one way, etc. But if the reference group should be a different group, then you have to do something about it. Either you can change your variable names, so that the reference group comes first alphabetically, or what would be better is, you may want to try this. We have a variable called G1 order, and you give in it the order that you want the groups in. So you don't say 3, 2, 1 or something like that. You actually give the names for the category levels that you want it ordered. So you say you want mono AAD step 1. So if you do that, then you will get output like this. So So if you say G1 order is this, so you now mono is the reference group, and now the effects are given as AAD versus mono and step 1 versus mono. Whereas here it's mono versus AAD and step 1 versus AAD. And you will see easily that these intercept and and the coefficients here are equivalent to these. That minus 16.7 now becomes instead of mono minus AAD, it's the AAD minus mono with the opposite sign, and so on. Okay, so another cartoon about leap years. So in my class, I usually ask students if they know whether 2000 was a leap year and whether 2100 is a leap year or not. So you might want to Google that and amuse yourself. And 2400, not that any of us are going to be around for that, but maybe as a little exercise. I want to go to the next level of complication, which is going back to sex and diet. Maybe you want to have a covariate in that model. So that is, I want to have TC3 as a covariate with diet and sex. I'm still keeping diet in the third position because I like the way the output comes out. So I moved sex to the last position, and the rest of it to say CU-COV two-way. You can copy paste. I should have mentioned it a long time ago. You can also hit the arrow, up or down arrow, and edit what's in the console. That's another way to do it as well. But anyway, it's probably simpler to copy paste. So for that, at least for my lecture. And so if you do that, you will now get analysis controlling for TC3, comparing diets and sexes. So there's a lot of output, and you will. So you can see here there are 6 lines because you have 6 groups. Now, at the moment, the slopes are assumed to be the same in all the groups, so the lines are all parallel. But there is interaction between diet and sex, so the sex difference is not the same in all 3 diets, and diet effects are not the same in F and M. And so you get all that here. It is very similar to what you got in CU two-way. So you have diet comparisons within each sex group, but the order is different here. And then you have sex comparisons within it between diet groups. 39.8 is the difference between the sexes for the mono effect. And 38 is the difference between the sexes for the step 1 effect, and so on. So it also compares with simpler models. So you can see here that in fact this COV two-way is an improvement over all simpler models. And same slope, no interaction, etc., etc. So we're going to do the same slope, no interaction, and it's significant compared to that. So the 2-factor ANCOVA model with interaction explains the data much better than all of these possibilities. Again, you can allow slopes to be different by adding some C. Just again, for Sarah and other people's benefit, yeah, this is just the TC3 levels that I'm interested in comparing. There's nothing fixed about it. And I could have given C of 150 or C of 190. So you now have a much more complex model. You have the regression, you have the slope, and the slope changes with diet and sex, and the slope then also changes with combination. So you'll be going to have 6 non-parallel lines. So these lines are all different slopes, and that the program takes care of, and then it does the comparisons. Now, all this is at 160. It does the comparisons as we saw before, the diet effects within F, the diet effects within M, sex differences within each diet, and the comparison. And all this is at TC pre of 160. Next, it does it for TC pre of 180. And then, so it's a lot of output, but that is there because you asked for it. Because you told the program, I'm interested in comparing diets and sexes, and I want to control for TC pre, and the control may be different in the different groups. So that's what is going on here. And again, it does a partial F test with simpler models, but you can see here that it is not better than with the same slope, what we saw before. So it's the same slope with interaction does just as well. So there is no need to use this model. So that's the value. It says here, overly complex, consider a simpler model. And I'm going to just skim through these. As with two-way, you can specify no diet-sex interaction. And so there are parallel lines, and the comparisons are simpler. However, it is not an improvement over a simpler model. And you can also have slopes varying without interaction, and you get some output, and that too doesn't improve over a simpler model. So I think I'm done for the day. So